Keep Our Republic is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. Since the spring of 2020, we've been doing our part to help keep our republic. We do it through hyper-localized civic education. We talk with Americans through town halls, legal seminars, media briefings, and other events. We know a lot of Americans have a lot of questions right now about how our democracy really works. Questions like, what actually happens behind the scenes on election night, and just what is the power of the federal courts? That's why we're talking directly to election officials and judges from across the country. Together, we can help answer some of those questions. Welcome back, everyone, to Keepers of Our Republic. My name is Brooke Bergen. I'm the Special Projects Manager here at Keep Our Republic. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit working to strengthen trust in our elections and democratic institutions. Today, I get to sit down with Judge Gary Fease. He's formerly the senior judge for the Central District of California, my hometown. He served on the district court bench from 1999 to 2015. Before then, he was a Superior Court judge in Los Angeles, as well as an assistant U.S. attorney for the Central District as well. Thank you, Judge, for joining us. And how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Fantastic. Well, one of the things I forgot to mention in your bio there is, of course, you're also a member of the Keep Our Republic Article 3 Coalition. One of the first things I always like to ask our guests is, why, when you could be enjoying something like a retirement, I know you're, I think, still involved in arbitration or mediation.
I
Uh,
am.
so, so why take the time to join an additional item to put on your calendar?
Well, to me, it seems like a very limited commitment in the sense of time, given the importance of the issue. And I was most attracted to it by the idea that we have a number of sitting judges who are frankly under attack
Mhm.
and they can't speak out for themselves. So the Article 3 coalition can speak for them.
Yeah.
We are nonpartisan as a group. We're speaking in support of the rule of law, and sometimes that means we have to speak up on behalf of current judges. And we also know that there have been a number of judges who are under threat, and there have been some horrific,
Mhm.
terrible things happen to judges and their families, and somebody needs to stand up for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to swing back around to that, but for a second, you mentioned that it's a nonpartisan, bipartisan, however you want to call it,
Right.
coalition.
Mhm.
Yourself were a Clinton appointee when you joined the federal bench. Our past guests have been, Reagan, Bush one, Bush two appointees. What do you think the value is of bringing people who have such a wide range of maybe personal political backgrounds and bringing them together to speak on these specific issues?
I think it shows that there are general principles that everyone agrees on.
Mhm.
Now, it seems that there's a lot of talk in the media today suggesting that that's not true, but it clearly is. I know it's been said by a number of people in a number of circumstances, but when I was on the bench in California, I couldn't have told you who appointed my colleagues. At one point, you may think about it a little bit and say, "Oh, gee, I wonder how long they've been on," and that sort of thing will tell you who appointed them. But I never remember any big partisan infighting at a judges meeting. That just wasn't on the menu.
Yeah. Do
So
you would you get obviously you're not still on the bench. Would you hazard a guess that that is still the same today?
I think it depends on the district.
Mm,
I think that the Central District of California has been fairly lucky. Um, I mean, in part, it's because we're so far away. I don't think we're necessarily
yeah.
viewed at the same level of importance, frankly. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I know that certainly in the first Trump administration, Nick Hanna was the U.S. attorney, and he was sort of right in the mainstream. I know at least one of the Trump-appointed judges was Stan Blumenfeld,
Mhm.
and I've known him. I was involved in hiring him to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Civil Division, many years ago. And ironically, he was on the Superior Court, and it was my wife, who was a grade 4 deputy district attorney, who was his courtroom deputy for 5 years. So,
That's
yeah.
great. Yeah.
So, these things certainly didn't used to matter, but I think they do now somewhat. And I think the higher up you get, unfortunately, the more political it has become.
Yeah. I I can't help but take a brief detour for a second before we get
Sure.
into your history on the bench. You were, as you said, and I said, an AUSA for the Central District.
Sure.
Obviously, AUSAs are very much in the news these days. I think more so than people are perhaps used to. And it seems, at least from the outside, that the position is being quite more heavily politicized than it traditionally has been. I know we're a judge facing, bench facing organization, but in terms of what are some of the red flags or concerns you have when you see the prosecutorial branch of the state being so heavily politicized, or you might just disagree and say that's not true at all.
Oh, it's clearly true.
Yeah,
It's worse than the court, in my opinion.
yeah,
Um, when you have a chief executive who is essentially through public means, I mean, I don't have any inside information. I just read the tweets,
yeah,
or whatever they're called now. And it's, when the chief executive is saying, um, go after this person and find a crime, I mean, that is turning the system upside down.
right.
I mean, the system that I was familiar with and the way it worked during my years, and by the way, they spanned Democrat and Republican
Hmm.
administrations. Um, the system worked where you looked for possibly criminal behavior and then investigated whether there was criminal behavior, and if so, who was engaged in the criminal behavior. It
Right,
wasn't the other way around. And
right.
so I think that it is a huge problem. Um, I have information that in Los Angeles, there have been a number of no bills from the grand jury, and that's just not something
Yeah.
that ever happened before. I think in the 10 years that I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office, there was one no bill.
Yeah, that's people like to make the joke of, you can indict a ham sandwich, right? And I
Yeah.
like to brag to non-attorneys that, oh yeah, I had 100% success rate when I was in the grand jury as a prosecutor, and people think that sounds impressive until you know that most of the time you are getting a true bill. So to have these grand juries, and I'm sure eventually petit juries as well, um, sensing to some extent the politicization that they're seeing from behind the bar is pretty scary, and pretty different than what we've seen, that sort of conduct from the AUSAs before.
Hard to
Uh,
imagine that
yeah,
they're not seeing that. And
yeah,
I will say this. Um, yes, I mean, people say, well, it's easy to get an indictment. The truth is, the cases that we brought, if getting an indictment were easy and you were
sure,
bringing bad cases, you'd lose them at trial.
yeah,
But we didn't lose cases at trial.
no,
That wasn't what happened because the cases were good and they were easy to indict because the FBI agents and the witnesses that we called had the information to show that yes, the crime was committed. I don't know if you know this, but the judge who made the ju who was complaining that anyone can indict, I mean, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich, was later found to have committed crimes and prosecuted for those crimes and convicted. So, um, yeah,
Oh
well,
man. Yeah,
yeah,
the great irony. You gotta love a little
very, very ironic. Yes.
very ironic. Well, let's talk about the bench then. So you were in private practice, you obviously were a prosecutor. What inspired you to make the step over to sitting on the Superior Court and then obviously eventually on the federal bench?
Well, I always found public service much more interesting and rewarding than private practice. I mean, you can certainly make a lot of money in private practice. It's very lucrative. But the truth was, I hardly enjoyed any of my time in private practice. I was so happy to go back to public service. And of course, public service through serving as a judicial officer is not something that you can just decide
Hmm.
and say, okay, well, my next job is going to be a judge of the Superior Court.
Right.
Um, Somebody has to recognize that you would be appropriate for the job for whatever reason. In my case, I wasn't particularly political, and so I was very fortunate that a couple of people who I had worked for thought that I would be good for the job, and that was sort of the pathway.
That's fascinating. And I think, we hear the refrain of public service over and over as we've been doing these interviews for the podcast and the value that people have. It's interesting. It feels like in many ways, uh, the idea of public service as a honorable, steady profession, seems to not exist as healthily as it did before. And yeah, I hope it's encouraging to people to see how much people have valued and genuinely enjoyed public service. I had a very brief stint in private practice before I went to the DA's office, and yeah, it was a no-brainer for me that public service has immense value both as a public good, but as a personal fulfillment. There's just nothing like it.
Yes, I was just a little over a week ago. I was talking with Rob Bonner, who is a former district court judge and a former U.S. attorney and assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles. And we were talking about events. And I said, I said, people don't believe that I really enjoyed public service more than the private sector, or that I didn't at some point regret going into public service because of the enormous returns that people are making in the private sector now.
Yeah.
And I said, but I never really did. And I worked harder as an assistant United States attorney than I ever did in any other job. That
Yeah.
was the most work I ever did. And I didn't regret a day of it. I mean, I loved every second of it.
Yeah. I want to ask to make sure I'm getting the timeline right. When you were in private practice, is that when you were a part of the Christopher Commission in Los Angeles?
Actually, yes.
Okay.
The history is pretty interesting
Okay.
because we had, if you look at the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, in the 30s and the 40s, the department sought out um, uh, officers who, shall we say, were of a certain point of view in
Hmm.
regards to folks who had darker complexion than their own. And it was very much like a southern city in some
Hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
Then the first major event in my memory were the Watts riots
Yeah.
in '65, I believe. And the Watts riots then triggered the McCone Commission. The McCone Commission then made a number of recommendations as to what should happen and what reforms should be implemented. And there was some gestures toward doing that, but not anything that ultimately turned out to be effective. So you fast forward almost 30 years, and there were a lot of complaints over those periods of time about police misconduct, excessive use of force, and so forth. And then there was the Rodney King case. And it was videotaped, of course. We all remember
Hmm.
those videos. And it caused a public outcry and actually did cause a major um, civil disturbance in the city of Los Angeles. I mean, what's been going on recently is nothing.
Yeah.
The idea that there's a need for National Guard in Los Angeles is really untrue. But it certainly was true. What was that, 92 maybe?
Yeah, somewhere around
Um,
there.
1990, and it was scary. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a big problem. So that then triggered the Christopher Commission. Christopher Commission then took a very deep dive into departmental practices and came up with a written report and again a number of recommendations. Um, those recommendations were not implemented in an effective way.
Mm,
Um, and in fact, while the Christopher Commission was ongoing, you had events occurring in Rampart, which later
right.
blossomed into the Rampart scandal. That actually became a very significant public matter in 1999. And in 1999, the Department of Justice filed suit against LAPD,
Hmm.
seeking a consent decree
Okay.
for a pattern and practice of police misconduct.
Oh, interesting.
So, pardon me?
I didn't realize there was such a huge gap between
Oh, yeah.
Rodney King and when the actual decree was being sought.
Yes, because the Rodney, I mean, the Christopher Commission had great ideas. It's
Yeah.
just that it had no authority to
Right.
implement.
Yeah.
So the consent decree, though, had real teeth, and it was negotiated in '99. I don't think it was actually filed until 2000. I think the case was filed in 2000, and the city, the department, and the Department of Justice agreed to the consent decree. And then it was um filed with the court, and as as luck or whatever you want to call it would have it, I drew the case. Uh, and it was assigned to me, and there was some consternation on the part of some of the civil rights practitioners, namely a fellow named Steve Yagman, who
Hmm.
was a very prominent critic of the Los Angeles Police Department, and he wrote articles saying why I shouldn't do it, um, and and it basically didn't matter. I was going to do it, and I intended to see it through. And it was in place for 10 years before I finally agreed to that enough had been done to
Mm.
warrant the police department moving out on its own. But I have to say that Mike Cherkasky, who was the monitor, and I think at that time was working with Kroll and Associates,
Hmm.
uh, did a fabulous job. It was Mike Cherkasky and Bill Bratton who really helped get that decree sort of implemented and rooted in the department in a way
Hmm.
that I think was pretty effective. And I still think that the LAPD is a better department because of it.
That's fascinating. Um, Another kind of iconic, you mentioned it in passing, iconic moment in LA history, particularly when it comes to the police department, was Rampart. Can you talk just a little for those maybe our East Coast listeners who don't know as much about that scandal? Can you just kind of briefly describe what happened there?
Well, the Rampart Division, excuse me, is west of downtown Los
Hmm.
Angeles. It's a heavily Hispanic area, and the police department, because of gang activity there, had a program called Crash, um, Community Something Against
Yeah,
Street Food.
it was an acronym for something.
It
Yeah.
was an acronym. And they put the people who were local in charge, gave them a tremendous amount of autonomy, and that without oversight. and that autonomy was to say that it was seriously misused would be a grotesque understatement. I mean, it really the single worst event in the whole situation was when a deputy named Rafael Perez and his partner Nino Durden tried to kill a citizen who was a witness to some of their wrongdoing.
Hmm.
I think that was Javier Ovando, maybe.
I think so, yeah.
Um, and there was a shooting, and then Ovando was crippled, and but it actually went undetected in a public sense for some period of time. But a number of other things, then there were thefts of drugs. They were
Hmm.
engaged in drug dealing, intimidation, extortion, and those were the police.
Yeah.
So um, it was it was a problem,
Yeah.
and it finally came to the fore, and that's when the Department of Justice acted and brought the lawsuit.
Right. So between both your time on the bench and obviously, as you said, just sort of drawing the straw for the consent decree, you're obviously no stranger to these high profile investigations, high profile cases. As you said, you had articles written about you and perhaps why you should or should not be overseeing a particular case. How do you feel that compares to what we're seeing now? That judges are under this intense, sometimes very violent scrutiny, both in the press and anyone with a Twitter account who wants to comment on who should and should not be overseeing a case.
I think the big difference now is the availability of social media, which allows anyone sitting at home
Yeah,
watching TV and texting or sending messages at the same time to say all kinds of outrageous things and broadcast it to the whole world.
yeah.
Uh, so I think that makes a difference. And then that triggers others. There's just, I think, there's kind of an online mob mentality to it, in my view.
Hmm.
And that wasn't really possible when I was on the bench, at least not, certainly not early on.
Hmm.
So while there were uh, commentary. There was commentary in public sources, the Daily Journal, LA Times, and sort of more traditional media. You didn't have the online situation, which really prevented sort of the publication of threat and threatening
Right,
behavior.
right,
And now you can round up, like a couple hundred people anytime you want to go down and as they did with Jackie Lacey when she
yeah.
was the DA, and they basically harassed her and trespassed on her property and stood around and made her life miserable during her last years as the district attorney.
Hmm.
Uh, that just wasn't possible in those days. I got
Yeah,
threats, but they were all manageable.
yeah. What are some other areas, if any, that you're seeing red flags in our society for how we're dealing with judges or perhaps these attacks on the rule of law as we, go through this second half of the first year of the Trump administration, which seems to be the longest year of everyone's life?
Well, uh, I don't know that it's a red flag in the judiciary per se. I mean, I think pretty much what the red flags are for prosecutions and for judges, and just general attacks on the rule of law. But to me, I see this the nastiness and the partisanship that's in politics starting
Hmm.
to seep into other areas of
Yeah.
life. I do arbitrations and mediations, and in my mediations practice, I am finding it harder and harder to get people to think about the notion of compromise.
Mm.
Uh, it seems like compromise is now a bad thing, that we have to stick to our guns. We have to, we're all people of principle. And if we can't reach agreement on my terms, we don't have an agreement. And that makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to settle
Yeah.
cases. It makes it difficult to get along with people. Um, so I think it's seeping in. I know people say that it's not a widespread problem if you really just go out and talk to people. And I think that's true if you talk to people about just say, well, how do you feel about X?
Mm,
But then when you tell them, well, that's the same way that a Republican or a Democrat feels about X, they go, oh, well, then maybe I have to change my mind.
interesting.
Uh, I mean, it's an observation. It's not data driven, but it seems to me that you can take you can take any subject. You can take a light bulb. Let's say you have have one of these new low energy light bulbs, and you sell it to one party as, hey, this is environmentally
Right.
efficient, and they'll buy it because of that. And if you tell that to a different group of people, they'll say, I don't want that. But if you tell them it'll save you money, then they will. So it's crazy.
And it's the same light bulb.
It's an LED. That's
Yeah.
right. It's an LED light bulb, and it uses a fraction of the electricity that an incandescent uses. But
Right.
it then becomes partisan. I mean,
Right.
vaccines. I mean, seriously,
Yeah.
vaccines are is a partisan issue. Yeah, I'm puzzled by that, but
Yeah.
what can I say?
Yeah.
It clearly has.
So one of the things before we wrap up that I've been asking all of our guests is, was there ever a time when you were at the bench where you ruled in a way that maybe your party wouldn't have expected, or that might not have aligned with your personal political beliefs, but that was what the law required in this situation, and so that was the ruling that you had to make.
Yes. I
Yep.
mean, if you're doing your job, the that has to be
Yeah.
yes. It has to be yes.
Yeah.
Um, but sure. I mean, let me give a simple example. Um, Sentencing,
Hmm.
mandatory minimum sentencings for very small amounts of crack cocaine. Um, those sentences, in my view, were generally um, uh, over the top,
Hmm.
um, far too long for the vice for the violation that was proven. But I mean, the statute, it's statutory, and it
Hmm.
had been held constitutional. So it's not for me to say whether or not that's right or wrong. It has been decreed that it is correct and that it should be done. Now, toward the end of my career on the bench, it was modified
Hmm.
and there were changes. But yeah, I mean that would be an
Yeah.
immediate example that comes to mind, and that happened frequently. Uh, Another example would be like in the area, and this is the other end of the spectrum, um, identity theft.
Hmm.
I always thought that the guidelines, and I think the guidelines were changed in at a later point in time, but I thought the guidelines were grossly underestimating the negative consequences to victims of identity theft violations, and that sentencing should be uh, much tougher in those cases.
Hmm.
Now, in those cases, I could do an upward departure and did on some occasions by making appropriate findings, and they were never reversed. But it's still there were still times when I never upwardly departed to the point where I thought this really is truly what this case is worth in terms of a sentence.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. I think people have, because of that, polarization, politicization of the judicial branch. I think people have this idea that on a controversial or even a non-controversial case that a judge's own political beliefs, the president who appointed them, kind of predetermines the outcome. And of course, we know that that's not true. And every judge we talk to has said, no, of course not. I decide based on the rules and the facts and the law that's in front of me. So thanks for speaking on that.
Yes, I mean, it's I do think that at the Supreme Court level, the
Yeah.
Supreme Court is much more of a, in a sense, making policy. Now they would say they don't. I remember the Chief Justice Roberts said, you know, when he was being nominated for the Supreme Court, that he just called balls and strikes. That's not what the Supreme Court has
Right.
never just called balls and strikes. The Supreme Court tells you what the strike zone is. That's what the Supreme Court does.
That's good.
And then you have to call balls and strikes when you're on the district court.
Yeah, that's good. So one thing before I let you go, we're recording in fall, but when this comes out, we'll be a lot closer to the holidays and the
Mhm.
end of the year. So I'm trying to end on a positive note. What are some things that you are seeing, or maybe a reason that we can be hopeful in 2026? Something that you do see positive on the horizon?
I see. So you kept the most difficult questions for
Exactly.
me.
I warmed you up
Uh,
for this, so.
yes. I would just say that the fact that there is pushback. I thought that when the Pentagon set rules for the journalists, that virtually all of them, including Fox News as well as
Yeah.
MSNBC, as well as the New York Times, that they all said no. We're not going to tolerate that. That's just not what journalists do. Um, Now that doesn't mean there aren't a couple who are there who um, are not really journalists. They're publicists and
Hmm.
propagandists, in my view. But I thought that was hopeful.
Yeah.
I think it's hopeful that at least some law firms have resisted when the White House demands payoffs for the right to litigate in federal court.
Hmm.
Um, Very disappointed that so many really good firms didn't. But yes, and I still think that the jury system is it is going to be a bastion of protection for the rule of law. I suspect that some of these cases that are being brought that really don't appear to have a lot of merit will have that effect. Although the negative, of course, is that anybody would um, have to actually respond to these charges. But
Hmm.
I think that's somewhat hopeful too.
Yeah.
Um, but you know, it's more like shoots in the spring. You know, like the first shoots out of the ground, and I don't know what's going to happen with elections. I mean, I'm very worried about the notion that there are going to be so-called election monitors
Hmm.
that are sent out around the country to monitor elections that are the complete 100% responsibility of states.
Hmm.
I, you know, we'll see. I mean, time will tell.
Yeah.
But I'm not naively optimistic, I don't think. I mean, I think there's some hopeful signs, but I think uh, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And I don't know how eternal our vigilance is at this point.
All right. Well, wise words to end on. Thank you so much, Judge. Thank you for joining the Article 3 Coalition and the work you do, speaking up on behalf of your colleagues, and all the work that is being done there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Quite welcome. Bye now.
Bye.
If you like this episode, please share it on social media and tell your friends. It's the best way for folks to find out about us. I hope you'll agree that our guest is indeed a keeper of the Republic. If you want to learn more about how you can help keep our Republic, stop on over to our website, keepourrepublic.org.